It was the kind of room where reputations rose and fell in the span of a sentence. The Senate committee hearing had drawn a crowd, staffers, reporters, lobbyists, all packed into the marble-paneled chamber where careers often collided with truth. At the center sat Senator John Neely Kennedy, leaned back slightly in his chair, a half-smile tugging at his mouth. The topic on the floor was government overreach, and Kennedy, with his Louisiana drawl and razor wit, was at his peak. He had just lobbed a barbed remark at a particularly self-righteous witness, a line sharp enough to draw laughter from both allies and rivals. The room erupted, not just in amusement but in relief. Kennedy's timing, as always, was impeccable. "Maybe," he said, pausing for effect, "if y'all spent more time reading the Constitution and less time reading your own press releases, we wouldn't be here." Even the stenographer chuckled. If you love real-life political drama with unexpected twists, don't forget to subscribe now for more gripping stories like this one. Kennedy adjusted his tie and scanned the room like a chess master, surveying a winning board. He relished these moments, not because he liked embarrassing others, but because he believed deeply in outthinking them, and he was good at it. Too good, some whispered. Then the door opened. It was subtle. No grand announcement, no security rush. Just the sound of brass handles turning, and a slight creak as a man entered quietly and stood at the back. Kennedy's eyes shifted toward the movement and froze. The laughter faded. Conversations dulled into a hush. It wasn't the man's appearance that silenced the room, older, perhaps in his 70s, with a full head of silver hair and a three-piece suit that seemed out of place in this modern arena. It was the aura, the kind of stillness that overtakes a room when history walks in. John Neely Kennedy sat upright. "Dr. Reinhardt," he whispered to himself, almost inaudibly. The man made no eye contact with Kennedy. He handed a folder to a staffer and took a seat at the rear of the chamber, where advisors and aides typically waited in silence. But his presence radiated something different. Authority without volume. Weight without mass. Dr. Malcolm Reinhardt had taught jurisprudence and ethics at Vanderbilt University for nearly 4 decades. A scholar's scholar. A man who shaped minds like Kennedy's back when power was a dream and not a burden. Reinhardt had once called Kennedy brilliant but unmoored. Their final interaction had been icy, unresolved. Now he was here. Kennedy's face, trained for decades to mask emotion, struggled to hold its composure. The senator cleared his throat and returned his gaze to the witness table, but the command was gone. His next question stumbled. Let me rephrase that," he said, fingers twitching slightly as he glanced once more at the back of the room. What no one else in the chamber yet knew, what even the committee chair hadn't been briefed on, was that Dr. Malcolm Reinhardt had been appointed just hours earlier as a special legal advisor to the committee, on direct request from the president. And he wasn't here to spectate. As Kennedy fumbled with his notes, the tide shifted. Not dramatically, not yet, but subtly. The laughter had died. The balance of power had shifted. No one else felt it, but Kennedy did. Deep in his bones, he knew this wasn't just an unexpected visit. It was a reckoning. John Neely Kennedy had never truly feared a man, not in courtrooms, not in Congress, not even on the campaign trail. But Malcolm Reinhardt was different. He didn't intimidate with power or position. He didn't need to. His authority came from something deeper, something Kennedy had spent decades trying to outrun, the memory of a man who once knew him better than he knew himself. The committee chamber continued its discussions, but Kennedy's thoughts were no longer in the room. They had slipped backward, pulled by a voice from another life. Vanderbilt University, 1976. A cavernous lecture hall. Reinhardt stood at the front, not teaching so much as confronting. His classes were infamous, not for workload but for exposure. He peeled students open with questions they didn't want to answer. "What is justice without conscience?" he had asked Kennedy once. Kennedy's answer, well-reasoned, articulate, had earned him applause from classmates. Reinhardt, however, had stared him down. "You argue with precision," he had said, "but I don't think you believe a word of it." It had stung. Kennedy had spent weeks trying to prove him wrong, to earn his respect, But Reinhardt remained cool, distant. The professor had once handed back a paper with a single sentence at the top: impressive structure, hollow heart. Their final clash came during a seminar on ethical absolutism. Kennedy had argued for flexibility in moral frameworks. Reinhardt called it cowardice, masked as pragmatism. The debate ended not with resolution but silence. Kennedy never returned to his office hours again, and now, decades later, Reinhardt was back, sitting silently behind him, speaking only when prompted, offering quiet commentary on draft legislation. Kennedy knew why he'd been chosen. The president wanted credibility, impartiality, and above all, unshakable integrity. Reinhardt had all three. In the days following his arrival, Reinhardt began participating more directly in committee briefings. His comments were brief but incisive. When Kennedy defended a provision allowing discretionary data withholding in federal agencies, Reinhardt offered a calm rebuttal. If transparency is subject to discretion, it ceases to be transparency. It becomes a tool of power. No one pushed back. Kennedy forced a smile but felt the ground shift under him. He told himself it was fine, that he could contain this, that Reinhardt was an academic, not a threat. But he couldn't ignore the glances from other senators, the subtle nods they now gave Reinhardt when he spoke. Influence wasn't just earned here, it was recognized. And Reinhardt, even in silence, was gaining it. Then came the closed-door session. It was a minor technical discussion, language tweaks to the bill. Reinhardt, seated across the long table, reviewed the document silently. Then, without looking up, he said, "There's a citation here that reminds me of a submission I once reviewed, Vanderbilt, 1976, a comparative analysis of Bentham and Kant." Kennedy's blood ran cold. It was the paper. He had borrowed structure from a peer's thesis, an error he had buried, justified at the time as minor, harmless. No one had ever confronted him about it. But Reinhardt remembered. There was no accusation, no name, just a memory, dropped like a stone in water. Kennedy looked up, eyes meeting Reinhardt's. For a moment, neither blinked. Then Reinhardt returned to his notes. The conversation moved on. The others hadn't noticed, but Kennedy had, and he knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. He told himself it was just a coincidence, just a reminder of days long past. But deep down, he knew better. Reinhardt hadn't come to watch, he had come to test. By the end of the week, the hearing transcripts were trending on political blogs. A sharp-eyed journalist noticed something odd. Senator Kennedy, usually unflappable, had stumbled several times in front of an otherwise routine witness lineup. His confident tone had cracked, and a few carefully worded answers felt evasive. Then came the blog post. It was buried at first, tucked away on a niche legal ethics site. The author, a former Vanderbilt student turned freelance writer, published a piece titled "The Paper Trail: Revisiting a Quiet Scandal." In it, she referenced an old rumor from the 1970s, a brilliant law student accused of academic dishonesty, protected by tenure politics and lack of evidence. She didn't name names, but the breadcrumbs were obvious to anyone familiar with the Senate. The article caught fire. Kennedy's staff scrambled to contain it. They issued a firm denial, called the story baseless, accused the writer of political bias. But the damage had begun. Journalists started digging. They found no proof, no formal record, but questions piled up. In public hearings, the tension bled through. Kennedy interrupted witnesses more frequently, snapped at colleagues, and offered curt responses to routine queries. Reporters began attending sessions not for policy coverage, but for spectacle. The moment that sealed it came during a post-hearing press scrum. A young journalist asked Kennedy directly, "Senator, is there any truth to the plagiarism allegations circulating from your time at Vanderbilt?" Kennedy didn't answer immediately. His face hardened. Then, with a forced smile, he replied, "My academic record speaks for itself. I graduated with honors. Next question." But the clip went viral, not for what he said, but how he said it. Back inside the committee room, Reinhardt's influence had grown quietly. Senators, regardless of party, began seeking his opinion on legal nuances. He offered insight without ego, cutting through partisanship with surgical precision. Kennedy watched as younger members deferred to him, nodding along as if Reinhardt had always been part of the institution. It wasn't personal, or so Reinhardt claimed. In meetings, he addressed Kennedy with the same polite reserve as any other senator. He never raised his voice. He never brought up the past. But Kennedy felt it all the same. Each response carried a weight, a reminder, and his allies felt it too. Behind closed doors, one senior staffer finally said what others had whispered. "You need to get ahead of this, Senator." "It's not just the story, it's how you're handling it," Kennedy snapped. "I'm not going to confess to something I didn't do." "No one's asking for that," the aide replied, "but your bleeding credibility." He knew she was right. But the worst part wasn't the media. It wasn't the whispers in the hallway, or even the president's subtle avoidance during a recent photo op. It was Reinhardt's silence. One afternoon, Kennedy cornered him after a closed session. His voice was low, sharp. "Did you leak it?" Reinhardt looked up from his brief. "Leak what?" "You know what." There was a pause. Reinhardt straightened his papers and met Kennedy's eyes. "I came here to advise the truth," he said, "not to haunt you." "But you never could tell the difference." Kennedy stood there, words forming and falling apart in his throat. The conversation ended not with an argument, but with Reinhardt walking away. Kennedy watched him go, the echo of his footsteps louder than any accusation. That night, the senator sat alone in his office, surrounded by silence he couldn't talk his way out of. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something he didn't know how to name. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was the feeling of being seen. The room was standing room only. Journalists packed shoulder to shoulder along the walls, cameras trained on the long table where senators sat in measured rows. It was the hearing that had drawn national attention, an open review of the Federal Transparency and Accountability Act, legislation that Senator Kennedy had championed from its inception. It was meant to be his legacy. Reinhardt sat quietly at the far end of the panel, flanked by a legislative council. He hadn't spoken yet. Kennedy led the opening statements, his voice steadier than in recent days, but his eyes flicked toward Reinhardt more than once. When the questioning began, Reinhardt finally leaned into the microphone. His tone was calm, almost gentle. "I want to begin by acknowledging the intent behind this bill. Transparency is essential. But we must ask, transparency for whom and at what cost?" He flipped through the proposed provisions one by one, pointing out vague language, inconsistent oversight mechanisms, and potential loopholes. His critiques weren't just academic. They were structural, systemic, and devastating. Kennedy interrupted only once. "With respect, Dr. Reinhardt," he said, tightening his jaw, "the intention is to safeguard agencies against weaponized bureaucracy." Reinhardt nodded. "And intention is noble. But as any first-year law student learns, legislation is not judged by intent. It is judged by consequence." The room quieted. Kennedy pushed back, invoking legal precedent and public polling. He cited national security, administrative feasibility, and political realism, but Reinhardt's answers were precise, built on a lifetime of study and lived ethics. And then came the shift. One senator asked Reinhardt about the principle of trust in public office. Reinhardt paused, then turned to Kennedy. "Senator Kennedy and I share a history," he began, drawing the room in. "He was one of the most gifted students I ever taught. His mind was agile, his rhetoric unmatched. But brilliance," he continued, voice even, "without anchor can be dangerous, especially in governance." Kennedy's face tightened. He straightened in his seat, prepared to respond, but Reinhardt wasn't finished. He described a case study once discussed in his class. A student who argued that morality was context-dependent, that sometimes truth must bend to political necessity. The senators listened, unsure if it was theoretical or personal. Kennedy knew. He remembered the classroom. He remembered his words. And he remembered the choice that followed. Years ago, faced with a scandal involving a peer, Kennedy had protected himself. He had passed along a quiet tip to a faculty advisor. anonymous technically, but decisive. The student had been disciplined quietly. The scandal never reached him. Reinhardt had said nothing at the time, but he knew. Now, decades later, that knowledge wasn't wielded as a weapon, but as a mirror. Kennedy saw himself reflected not in accusation, but in silence. In the way Reinhardt's voice filled the room not with condemnation, but with consequence. By the end of the hearing, it was clear. The bill wouldn't pass as written. Several senators proposed amendments. Some suggested a full rewrite. Others asked Reinhardt to consult more formally going forward. Kennedy sat still, hands folded on the table. The control he once commanded had shifted. The jokes no longer landed. The smiles from across the aisle were cautious, measured. As the chamber emptied, a young aide leaned over to him and whispered, "That was tough." Kennedy nodded once. Truth usually is. He stayed behind after most had left, staring at the nameplate in front of him. It no longer looked like a title. It looked like a weight. The aftermath was quieter than expected. No resignation, no formal censure. Senator John Neely Kennedy retained his seat, kept his committee assignments, and returned to work. But something had changed. The air around him. Colleagues still greeted him, but with caution. Reporters still followed, but with sharper questions. In political terms, he survived. In personal ones, he felt something closer to erosion. Dr. Malcolm Reinhardt declined a permanent advisory role. When asked by the committee chair, he simply smiled and said, "I came to illuminate, not to linger." Within a week, he returned to Tennessee. No press conference, no book deal, just a final memo and a handshake. Kennedy requested a meeting before he left. They sat in a small room behind the chamber. Just two men, no audience, no script. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Kennedy broke the silence. "Did I ever matter to you?" he asked. Reinhardt looked at him, not with judgment, but clarity. "You mattered immensely," he replied. "That was the problem." Kennedy nodded slowly. "You always thought I feared the truth." "I still do," Reinhardt said, "but I also think you feared failure more." A pause. Kennedy's voice was softer now. "Was I ever a good student?" Reinhardt took a breath. "You were brilliant, quick, persuasive, but brilliance is a blade, it cuts both ways. You learned to win, but you never learned to lose." Kennedy leaned back, eyes fixed on the floor. For once, he had no reply. Reinhardt stood. "You've still got time," he said. "The question is, for what?" He left without ceremony. Outside, the Capitol steps stretched wide and gray beneath the morning sun. Kennedy descended them alone, his shoes echoing in the open air. The city moved around him, cars, aides, tourists, but none of it reached him. Not really. He passed a group of students on a tour. One of them looked up, recognized him, whispered something to another. They didn't approach. They just stared. He turned away. In his office later that week, a reporter asked him how he would remember Reinhardt. Kennedy paused, then said, "As the man who stopped the room from laughing." The journalist asked what that meant. Kennedy didn't explain. He didn't need to. The legacy of that hearing was not in legislation passed or shelved. It was in tone, in memory. The jokes had faded. The clout had quieted. What remained was a single quiet shift in how truth was treated, not as a tool but a weight. And for Kennedy, it stayed with him, not as a scandal, not even as shame, but as a shadow. That evening, he sat in the silence of his office, pen in hand, staring at a blank legal pad. No cameras, no sound bites, just a man alone with questions he could no longer answer aloud. Some rooms remember words. Others remember silences. This one remembered the moment the laughter stopped, and everything that followed. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe and click the next video appearing on your screen. It's one you won't want to miss.